So moving on to slide 36. The Soviets were a very important force in China at this time. We've already talked about how the Soviets, through the Communist International, the thin veil of Moscow's actual control, exerted influence in revolutionary China. They were the sponsors, armorers, financiers of the Chinese nationalist revolution, and they were the controlling element and financiers and trainers of the Chinese communist movement. Why were they there? They were there because the Russians had lost a war with the Japanese in 1904 to 05, as you may remember. The Russians had interest to protect in their Far East. They did not want the Japanese to come north out of Manchuria and sweep through the Russian Far East and take it over. In particular, the areas abutting Manchuria in the Russian Far East, where there was not only reasonably productive agricultural land, but also the railroad that came from the main part of Russia east over the Urals and finally out through the vastness of Siberia to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. They wanted to protect all that. And so Stalin was particularly cognizant of the Japanese threat to the rest of the Far East. The Russians had been rather upset in the aftermath of the loss to Japan in 1905. Everybody remembered it. Everybody wanted revenge. And so he gave the task of keeping an eye on the growth of Japanese military power and the growth and changes in Chinese military power to Soviet military intelligence, the GRU. I don't speak Russian, so I can't tell you what that stands for. That was their main task, the Japanese and the Chinese armed forces. And as I mentioned, when Jiang Zuolin, the warlord who controlled Peking in 1927, invaded the Soviet embassy with the connivance of the British and the Americans, their military attachés who stood by to translate Russian documents. When he did that, they recovered documents which you can read today in the KMT archives in Taipei that showed this unbelievable network of agents throughout China in every little place you can imagine. If one goes through these records today, you can see GRU agents in so many small towns all over China. Practically every major city in China had a GRU network, and they had outstations or operatives in suburbs, and they were there, as I mentioned, one, to keep track of the Japanese, but two, to keep track of what was going on with the development of Chinese military power. So they were most prevalent. They were most of them were in these cities where the Japanese were present, but they were all over smaller places in China as well, where the KMT was developing and where the communists were developing. And they were not working together with the Chinese communists. They asked the Chinese communists for volunteers to be trained as agents in Moscow and to work with the Soviet GRU. And they got plenty of people to do that. They were typically identified by the Red Army and basically handed over to the Soviets for training and deployment. Let's you can. I don't want to go into this anymore because it's kind of a sidelight, but it's important to recognize that the real bottom line here is that of all the espionage organizations in China at the time, the Russian military intelligence had the best networks and knew the most about what was going on. That includes the Japanese. Next slide, very quickly. They had standalone agents as well, people who were foreigners. This woman here, Ruth Verner, was identified by Sorge, the man you saw on the last slide, and worked for him for a while in Shanghai. She had a small child. She was sent to Moscow for comprehensive training and then back to Manchuria, living locally with now 2 children by different husbands. And she did this incredibly dangerous work in China for many years, and eventually was sent to Britain, where the height of her career was running an atomic spy in the early part of World War II. So amazing things that were being done here. So going on to slide 38, how did Japan see Manchuria? To them, it was a place to resettle not only Koreans, but Japanese in a relatively sparsely populated place with lots of farmland and lots of industry. There was a lot of coal there and some petroleum, but not quite enough to supply the Japanese Empire that was developing. And because it was a start, but not the ultimate solution to Japan's plans for expansion, the Japanese ended up making plans to expand to Southeast Asia, which led to World War II. Let's go on to slide 39. But who was in their way? The KMT was in their way. If you look at some of the, I think this part is in the optional readings in the Taylor book, Chiang Kai-Shek developed the attitude he hated the Japanese, as so many Chinese did. But he was loath to immediately engage them militarily because he knew the Chinese forces were inadequate to the task. And so he developed a strategy of, as I think the Taylor reading puts it from his diaries, of hiding one's anger and preparing for the future, something like that. As well, at the same time, the Imperial Japanese Army was developing a rather unusual independence from its central government. And part of this was due to a growing ambivalence on the part of the Japanese military class, which you can tie straight back to their samurai class, in essence. Growing ambivalence toward the political leaders of the country and the business leaders of the country. Young officers and more senior officers, not the most senior officers, but those who were colonels and young generals, had a very bad attitude toward Japanese business. They thought that Japan, which had grown in strength, was becoming corrupted by the people in power, and they also recognized that there was some amount of left opposition, especially Union opposition, to Japanese expansion, militarist expansion in Asia. And so they were gradually, over the course of the time between 1929 and 1935, more or less, were becoming more and more separated, more and more antagonistic toward the political leadership and the business leadership of the country, and this eventually led to a military takeover of the government. But in the interim, Japanese commanders on the ground in Manchuria, quite often, when they could get away with it, they did whatever they wanted. They didn't care what the orders were from the general staff in Tokyo, whom they considered to be, and when I say the general staff, I'm speaking about the military leadership at the very top. They considered the general staff as well to be part of the corrupt oligarchs in Tokyo who had too much money, too much liquor, too many women, and not enough patriotism. So patriotic associations for these officers grew. If you like Kirin beer, that's K-I-R-I-N, Kirin beer. It has a name that's very much like the name of this particular society you see here. I don't think there's any connection, but it has a great label. The Kokuyokai, the Black Dragon, or the Amur River Society, which wanted to extend Japanese influence throughout Northeast Asia. And as this power grew, so did their desire to assert themselves in the strongest way possible. They started to assassinate public figures, and by the time we get to 1933, 1934, public figures in Japan who are not on the side of the military are living in fear. A very unusual situation. Let's go on to slide 40. So in the run-up to all of this, the Japanese army in Manchuria, again, was making and following their own foreign policy. The Foreign Office, the Foreign Ministry in Japan was viewed to be part of the oligarchs, on the side of the oligarchs, and they were largely ignored or bullied when they tried to object to these things. But a major element was the assassination of Jiang Zuolin in 1928. The Japanese military leaders believed that the obvious successor, Jiang Xueliang, would be more malleable than Jiang Zuolin, but it turned out that that wasn't the case. And over the next 2 years, the Japanese made plans to eventually expand into most of Manchuria from their bases that they had along the edge of that territory, mostly in the south. And so they manufactured an incident in 1931, which allowed an attack to proceed. And unfortunately for China, the forces of Jiang Zuolin's son, Jiang Xueliang, were no match for the Imperial Japanese Army. Again, it was a matter of fire and maneuver. The Japanese had they had tanks, they had more trucks, they had quicker firing artillery, they had better trained troops. They simply rolled over the forces of Jiang Xueliang, who was urged by Chiang Kai-Shek to withdraw into northern China so that his forces could fight another day. And this was one of the first things that led to popular dissatisfaction with Chiang Kai-Shek. For better or for worse, the public, which were by this time now, by 1931, was spoiling for a fight with Japan. There were boycotts going on against Japanese goods. People were calling for mass enrollment in the army. But the fact of the matter was that Chiang Kai-Shek knew that all of his troops were no match for the Japanese, and so he engaged in this strategy of giving away territory slowly but surely for time. And one of the reasons he did that, if we go on to slide 41, is that he believed that the communists were more of a threat in the long term than Japan. There's all sorts of research that's been done on this, and there's, I'd say there's some disagreement with what I just said on the part of J. Taylor in his biography of Chiang Kai-Shek. But I think this basic statement is true, that that Chiang Kai-Shek knew that he had to withdraw whenever the Japanese were intent on advancing, because there was no hope of beating the Japanese in the field, in particular anywhere close to the coast, because the Japanese Navy was so powerful. And by this time, that is by the late 20s and into the 30s, the British retained some power in China, but the Japanese, especially in northern China, were now in control of all the areas that they wanted to be in control of. And the only thing that was in their way were the Chinese nationalists, and this is why the Chinese nationalists received support, a lot of it, from the Soviet Union, and they would eventually receive support from Britain and the US, but not yet, not really during this time. So Chiang Kai-Shek, while he was looking for ways to delay Japanese expansion, was trying to exterminate the communists. And the extermination campaigns he ran were not only the 5 extermination campaigns that ended in 1935 against Mao Zedong and Zhu De's forces in Jiangxi, the military end of the Chinese Communist Party, but he ran what amounted to extermination campaigns in the cities. And as you can see on this chart, 1932 was a pretty bad year. 1931 wasn't too good either for the Chinese Communist Party. The reason so many communists were captured or killed in the urban areas in 1931 was because of the defection of their spy chief, who was named Gu Shunzhang. Gu is spelled G-U. You can look him up online, and I don't think he's really in very many of our readings. Gu Shunzhang. G-U-S-H-U-N-Z-H-A-N-G. Gu Shunzhang. He was caught by the nationalists in April of 1931. He gave up a lot of information. The communists lost thousands of people. As a result, the Central Committee, in essence, evacuated Shanghai at this point, and only a few people stayed. And about, by 1932, 9/10 of the communist leadership was in Jiangxi with Mao Zedong. 1932 was a horrible year, as you can see. 1933 wasn't much better. And in 1934, the Long March was to begin. Let's go on to slide 42. So in this desperate period, the first 4 encirclement or extermination, they're called both really in English, encirclement or extermination campaigns. The first 4 campaigns failed, partly because the communists knew what was going on, which we'll get into in a couple more slides, seemingly before the nationalists themselves knew what was going on. And this is because they had spies in Chiang Kai-Shek's headquarters, and this man here was one of them. And his spying, on the eve of the 5th and final extermination or encirclement campaign in October of 1934, gave the communists the information they needed to break out and begin the Long March. Hardly a successful military maneuver was the breakout and beginning of the Long March. They lost an awful lot of people. Going on to slide 43. Starting off with 100,000 troops, they marched into Yan'an. A year later, not Yan'an, but a place near Yan'an, in the northwest there, with 10% of the people they started off with. Enormous, enormous losses. When they passed through Tibet, they were attacked and left there as quickly as they could. They on their way west, they mostly were able to gain assistance from local populations, but not in Tibet. They were attacked mercilessly, lost a lot of people in that part of the country, and eventually got out. On their way to the west, on their way to Tibet, they stopped in a place called Zunyi. We go on to the next slide, slide 44. And here, Mao, who had been stripped of his military portfolio a year before, argued, as they reassessed what had happened so far. They had had heavy casualties up to this point. Mao argued that Otto Braun, the military advisor from the Comintern, had provided rotten advice, that his tactics has resulted in enormous casualties, and that the leadership, the military leadership of Bogu, who is at the left in that photograph there in the corner, and Zhou Enlai had not helped things very much. Mao was able to convince the Central Committee that his own style of military engagement that was less standard, less conventional, and more guerrilla style maneuver would work better against the nationalists, and he was reinstated as chairman of the Military Commission. So this was the beginning of Mao's final ascendance to power, which took him until 1942 to consolidate politically. The Chinese Communists like to say in their official histories that Mao took control of everything at Zunyi in January 1935, but that's just not true. It took a number of years before he was able to do that. We'll stop this recording here and go on to slide 45.